We can also call it the literary genre of a philosophical text. The discussion of the form and style of a philosophical text is actually a very vital discussion for philosophy, and a discussion that is increasing towards the present day.
Hello everyone from Istanbul School. Dear viewers, our guest this week is Prof. Dr. Ali Utku. Welcome, teacher.
Thank you.
How are you?
Thank you. I hope you are well too.
Thank you very much, teacher. We want to talk about the issue of style in philosophy, but first I would like to start with an article of yours, with your permission. An excerpt from your article, The Issue of Style in Philosophy, the Relationship Between Form and Content, and Rhetorical Strategies. Borges mentions that when he first encountered the works of the philosopher Martin Buber in his youth, he thought they were wonderful poems, and later, when he read a book written by Dostoevsky Dijon, he understood with great surprise that Buber was a philosopher and that all his philosophy was in the books he read. Borges, who uses certain philosophical doctrines in his short stories, such as nominalist language theories in Fewness and infinite memory, in Tulun, Ukbar, Orbis, Tertius, Berkeley, and idealism, the scaling of conceptual shamans in the search for Averroes, traditional conceptions of immortality in the immortal, and so on, to imagine fictional worlds where they gain truth and take philosophical positions through a series of logical operations in the results, this time in favor of literature, the categorical generic distinction between philosophy and literature. This anecdote that ironically displaces perhaps what is most striking in this anecdote is that I accepted those books because they came to me not as arguments but with poetry, allusion, and the music of poetry. Change. With this claim that finds imagination and musicality more convincing than argumentation for a philosophical text, we are tempted to think about the form-content relationship in philosophy, rhetorical strategies, the abundant and diverse tools of written expression, and the problem of different writing styles and forms. You say, my teacher, from here, many doors are actually opening up for us. When we take this as a question, how do you evaluate the form superstructure issue in this philosophy?
Yes, what is being problematized there, as we mentioned, is a Turkish categorization between literature and philosophy. Historically, the philosophy-literature relationship points to an irreducible problem that has been discussed in Western philosophy at least since Plato. But let's say here, this problem, at least in our cultural world, is discussed more in the context of the philosophical implications of literary texts for culture, that is, poetry and philosophy, for example, how the philosophical implications of poetry can be revealed, etc. What the philosophical value of poetry is, or fictional texts such as novels, stories, Borges's narratives are an example here, because he also really poses philosophical problems in his own narratives, in his stories. For example, in The Garden of Forking Paths that we mentioned there, a hero asks the person who comes to his door, "How could you come to my door when you were my enemy in one of the possible pasts?" We encounter a story that we can conduct philosophical discussions on or read in that context, starting from the discussion on the truth status of propositions regarding the future or contingent propositions in Aristotle's Perihermenias, and ending with Leibniz's doctrine of possible worlds. Therefore, what I mean is that the philosophical implications of literary texts are being addressed in a way that also brings this generic categorization to the agenda, or in the context of what we can think of as philosophy's contribution to literature, this issue is being addressed in the context of discussions such as literary theory, literary criticism, and the interpretation of literary texts. Here the problem is actually reversed. In other words, the application of philosophy to literary genres, or the problem of philosophy style of a philosophical doctrine, or let's say in reverse, if appropriate, the issue is being addressed. In fact, it is an extremely important discussion in terms of philosophy, an extremely important discussion. Now, if we continue with an example, for example, when we take Nietzsche's work, which is translated into our language as Total Redness, as soon as we open its cover, an underground. Here is an underground in this text. I mean, the preface, those who have a book in their hands, if they open and look in this text, you will come across an underground worker. Here is the one who is constantly digging, trying to move forward in the dark, metaphorically. He even compares the philosopher to the mole, that is, himself to the mole. As you know, Socrates compares him to a horsefly, etc. Or like Wittgenstein's metaphor of a fly in a fly bottle. This time, with the mole metaphor, the philosopher is a mole. A man who works underground, works in the dark, tries to move forward in sweat. The underground worker may think that he is faced with a poet, that is, a literary text, just like Boreas thought he was a poet when he read this book.
It is treated as a metaphorical narrative.
It is already known that the reason why Nietzsche is read with great pleasure by the masses, but at the same time the difficulty of understanding Nietzsche's philosophy and Nietzsche's thought lies here. In other words, Nietzsche is probably one of the most problematic names in this regard in terms of the problem we will address or take up. Now let's make more general observations, because philosophy actually comes across us with examples that apply to almost all literary genres throughout its history. When we go back to the ancient age, here are the poems of Parmenides or the pre-Socratic world. Let's say we come across poetic texts of Plato.
Dialogues.
Not only Plato, but also Hume Berkeley. In terms of very classical Western literature, there are letters, essays, Let Me Tell My Master. In other words, when we come to the present day, let's say, what really needs to be mentioned is, on the one hand, the perception of form, the perception of philosophy produced by analytical philosophy. On the other hand, the expansion of academic professional philosophy. In other words, philosophy becoming an academic activity and the emergence of what we call articles or academic texts as a category, a form, issues such as a narrowing, homogenizing attitude. In other words, although such homogenization situations are in question in the history of philosophy, we are not actually faced with homogeneous texts. In other words, philosophers come across us with very different texts. In other words, Spinoza has ethics. Let me tell my master, Wittgenstein has Tractatus. Maybe Wittgenstein is one of the very serious examples in this respect, because on the one hand it is a text written in a logical order like the Tractatus. On the one hand, in philosophical studies, let's say with the item numbers, let me tell my aphoristic master, a text he wrote. Therefore, it presents two separate texts, two separate examples, etc. When we look at it broadly, there are many things. That is, we can relate to the period, to the person. That is, for example, in the Middle Ages, in the Islamic world, there were texts written in the form of questions and answers, which they called es'il and esibe, and in the West, texts called questions, which are texts that can be seen as parallel. Here are essays like Montaigne's essays. I mean, these examples can be increased, the examples that come to mind right now. So, of course, we need to ask here. That is, this is what we call the relationship between form and content. So we can roughly say this, there is a philosophical content. This, we can also call it doctrinal didactic content. There is also the style, the form used to convey this content, the philosophical content, the doctrinal content. Questioning the relationship between these two, that is, what is in question here. Of course, first of all, we need to ask this, namely, determining a form, the importance of determining. Namely, how does a philosopher choose a form to convey his philosophy? According to what? According to which criteria does he choose? Then, which type or form is more suitable for conveying a content? Very classical information. We need to look at Plato's dialogues as texts, because Plato's dialogues were supposed to be written in this style. The reader says this. Why? Because Plato has a dialectical form exactly as he desired in these dialogues, and let's say that Socrates is the main speaker. Conceptual analyses are generally made in the texts. There is a definition activity and so on. Namely, the form and content are quite suitable. Yes, very suitable. They fit together. Plato has captured this. This form is really what gives Plato's philosophy. so maybe the person who reads it thinks this is the most appropriate. At the same time, he asks what would have happened if it had been written in a different form. Therefore, it is necessary to state Plato here. Although he seems like a philosopher who has trouble with art and literature, poetry, because he expelled poets and artists from the state, he's also a very master writer. We can say that he is one of the greatest names in Western literature. Therefore, the relationship between the dialogue form and Plato's philosophy. So, this is a question such as to what extent a form can reflect a philosophical content, or what are the criteria for this, or at the same time a problem related to the evaluation of the content of a philosophy based on a form, in other words, the evaluation of a philosophical content by taking the form as a priority, can be put. In its classical sense, it can be said like this. When we talk about form and content, the content is related to what a text says. In other words, what does this text say? When we talk about form, how does it say it? To put it very roughly. Therefore, this actually brings us directly to the problem of style, and the fact that style is being developed does not mean that the issue should be handled only as a discussion, because that is exactly what we mean according to the question we asked. In other words, the problem is to what extent does the form of a philosophical text concern or affect its content. There is another dimension to the event, because philosophers are also creative figures. Let's even use the notion of creative genius here. Therefore, we need to talk about the uniqueness of every philosophical text. Therefore, in fact, the philosopher reveals his own uniqueness through style by finding his own philosophical history. Just like in poetry, he needs to find his own voice, his own language. What kind of poet should he be? In order to be a poet, he needs to determine his uniqueness in a sense without imitating others. The same is necessary for philosophy. When this is a formal search as well as a doctrine or a formal issue, we mean it. In this respect, as we said earlier, Wittgenstein is a very interesting example because, for example, he first takes notes in notebooks for the Tractatus. His work is related to logic. The basic problem is logic. Then an intermediary text was formed from those notebooks. Finally, he reaches the Tractatus, and this is actually a gradual search, in other words. It is both an intellectual search because it is a formal effort on the way to reach the doctrine, that is, the theory called the theory of pictures presented in the Tractatus. So Tractatus is really a poetic text as well. In other words, as we said earlier, it is a genius work that gives the philosopher his uniqueness. It wouldn't be an exaggeration. Wittgenstein publishes only one text in his life. Let's call it a philosophical text, that is Tractatus. His second important text, his philosophical studies, he actually worked on it continuously until his death, etc. However, after his death, the text was published by his students. You might ask, why was this text so delayed? This also plays a role in this. In other words, you wrote and presented a text like Tractatus in your 20s. You left Tractatus behind. A text that will surpass this. In other words, don't surpass yourself. Poets also have this. It is also related to the thing that is the content of the text. Because Tractatus is a text that most strongly reflects the method of the early period of analytical philosophy called logical analysis, and it became a handbook for that period and environment. In other words, it also reflects the content because it is in the form of numbered references. The book consists of 7 basic propositions, 7 basic propositions and their extensions, numbered propositions. Within a very strict logical order, even the book itself resembles a ladder, as if it takes us to a theoretical level, let's say. And finally, even the book itself, that is one of the most striking aspects of the book that needs to be discussed, is that this ladder should be thrown aside after climbing that ladder. Let's say this book is also a 70-page book and it reckons with the entire history of philosophy and declares the end of philosophy. To philosophize for the last time, never to philosophize again. Therefore, they are called the fire escape of philosophy. In other words, philosophy is burning. You will escape from there. You use this ladder for evacuation. Then you leave the ladder in the fire, in the sense of, if we read both the preface of the Tractatus and the preface of the philosophical studies, we will see that both the philosophical contents of the 2 periods, Their doctrinal frameworks and the relationship between them and the text are also problematic in the philosopher's own mind.
So, how does the issue of form become a problem today?
Yes, let me emphasize this to get there. Now, the classical approach is actually related to the classical understanding of the regime of truth. The example I mentioned in that text is Plato's Dialogues. A German philosopher, Tennemann, criticizes and says that this form, the form he uses, constitutes an obstacle to understanding the content of the dialogue, the philosophical core, etc., because the approach of that period or an approach within that framework highlights the content of the text. It does not problematize it. In other words, it is an approach that centers on teaching and teaching. Schiller-Mahier actually comes right after him. Schiller-Mahier, this time with a hermeneutic approach, on the contrary, focuses on the form of the text. And from that date on, at least let's say from that date on, we see this. We are faced with so many comments, so many evaluations about why Plato wrote in the form of dialogue, that is, the form and content of Plato's text with that form. Derrida gives one of the strong examples of this in his text translated as Plato's Pharmacy for Our Religion. In other words, the reason he did not leave any work is understood from there that he is against books. Because let's put it roughly like this. Right now, while I'm speaking, what is the owner of the word? It also has a relationship with the soul. What we call breath should be considered as an extension of the living soul. The person speaking is here. Therefore, I am the owner of the word. What does the book do? The book is the author or the word, even though it is not the owner of the word. It carries, therefore, let's say that in the Socratic sense, the book opens up a space for the mixing of words. In this context, the answer to the question of why Plato wrote in the dialogue style in Derrida's analysis, in other words, since the dialogue is in the conversational style, it is a tool to make the text, at least in the air of speech, live word, animation, dead word, the words in the book alive. This is an interpretation, for example, but apart from that, it can be interpreted in different contexts, such as using the dialectical method that we mentioned earlier, that is, the method adopted by Plato, or the Socratic, ironic, and meiotic methods. Now, as we come to the present day, the issue of form comes to the forefront, as we said earlier. We can say that the reasons for this, that is, it is related to the fact that philosophy became language mediated in the 20th century, and activity through language. Indeed, when we look at 20th century philosophy, the discussions of the theory of text, meaning, and interpretation are very decisive. Like the example of Derrida that we gave earlier, or the great names of the 20th century such as hermeneutics, Heidegger, Gadamer, and so on. And in this context, text writing, all of these actually become a very serious problem. The 20th century, but we need to take it back. The Nietzsche example we gave at the beginning is probably extremely important. He is one of the names who realized that language has a decisive place in the reckoning with Western metavisualization. In fact, for example, the issue of decentering the subject. There, Nietzsche says that the subject is an imposition of grammar on us. Therefore, can we imagine a language without a subject? In fact, the language we use connects us to metaphysics with deep metaphysical roots. Therefore, if we want to get rid of metaphysics, what we need to do is actually calculate with language. Aren't there examples of this? Of course there are. In the 20th century, we come across such linguistic searches among philosophers who focused on the decentering of the subject. Heidegger, Wittgenstein, post-structuralist philosophers Derrida, Deleuze, Foucault, etc., are philosophers who focused on the issue of form to an extreme extent with this consciousness of language. Therefore, they appear before us as names who write and think with awareness of the relationship between form and content. For example, we see that the discussion of the death of the author, which seems like a literary discussion, is considered in Foucault's text directly within the framework of questions such as how the author will distribute himself as a subject in his texts. The prominence of the issue of form is purely what can we say, an ornament. The classical approach sees language as a tool. There are actually very deep issues. So let's say in the context of the theory of representation, language is seen as a means of communication, not directly related to philosophy, that is, to the content and philosophical content. And it is thought that what needs to be done is to eliminate the malfunctions that may arise from language in the transmission of that content. In the Tractatus, he says that philosophical problems stem from a misunderstanding of the logic of religion. Therefore, it reduces it to a linguistic problem. There, it imposes a uniform logic on the language, but in its late period, it takes meaning as usage. In its early period, meaning is reduced in the context of the theory of representation. In other words, factual propositions are propositions that depict facts, while it reaches a theory such as meaning is actually the fact depicted. In its late period, it says meaning is usage. So we can say that in philosophy, the context in which we use it, in other words, the language used, becomes effective as much as contextuality. Let's complete it with the relationship between literature and philosophy by pointing to another example. An important philosopher named Martha Nussbaum says that a novel is a philosophical text, and especially when it comes to moral philosophy. It does things that classical ethical discussions and abstract conceptual discussions cannot do. In other words, it has such an effect in terms of directly affecting the reader, touching his moral life. And she says that we should consider the literary genre we call morality, that is, the novel, as a text of moral philosophy. Such examples can be multiplied. Perhaps what we mean by this example can also be understood. In other words, what we did not mention was this. Philosophers also write fictional texts. The most famous ones are Sartre and Camus. Perhaps it is necessary to say this in closing. We mentioned two names who won the Nobel Prize for their fictional texts, Sartre and Camus. There are philosophers who won the Nobel Prize for the literary style of their non-fictional philosophical texts. Yes, like Bergson and Russell. Therefore, we can also call it the literary genre of the philosophical text. The discussion of the form and style of the philosophical text is actually an extremely vital discussion for philosophy, and a discussion that is increasing towards the present day. And we see that courses on philosophy of style are given in Western universities. Therefore, it allows us to state that it also corresponds to the institutional structure in terms of showing the importance of the issue.
Yes, okay, teacher, thank you very much.
Thank you.
It is a very deep issue, as you said, and it is an issue that is being discussed today as a philosophy of style, and it is actually getting deeper. We have opened the door as much as we had time. Thank you very much.
I thank you.
Thank you, teacher.
Thank you.
Dear viewers, this week we talked about the issue of style in philosophy with our guest Prof. Dr. Ali Utku. See you in the next episode. Goodbye.